What would you do if a 9-year-old beggar girl, wearing a red knit hat and boots painstakingly patched with silver duct tape, stood in the biting winter cold and told you, "Sir, I can help your son walk again"? Would you dismiss it as a prank, an empty promise, or dare to believe that sometimes miracles arrive via the most unexpected, tiniest hands? And then, how would you feel when you saw that miracle unfold? It was a winter morning in Birmingham, Alabama. The chill here wasn't the bone-freezing cold of the north, but it was sharp enough that each breath curled into thin white clouds around your lips. On 7th Avenue, in front of Highland Crest Children's Medical Center, people bustled in and out. Doctors clutching clipboards, young mothers bundled in scarves holding infants, older men hurrying past, all bearing the weight of unspoken worries. No one spoke. Everyone seemed to be racing against some invisible fear, hoping today would be different, better than yesterday. But amid the rush, at the foot of the hospital's gleaming revolving doors, there sat a lone, small figure. Zora Carter, 9 years old, black, slender, her deep brown eyes quietly observant, perched on a threadbare piece of cardboard at the curb. Her gray coat swallowed her frame, the collar frayed, the sleeves rolled up to reveal dry, rough hands. Her red knit hat was pulled low over her brow, cocooning her ears and shading a face pale from the wind. At her feet lay a pair of battered canvas boots, their torn toes meticulously sealed with strips of silver duct tape that caught the weak sunlight with every shift of her weight. Zora didn't extend her hand for alms, didn't call out for attention. In front of her lay a well-worn notebook, its pages yellowed from damp and sun. While passers-by hurried on, she sketched, delicate pencil lines that hesitated, then struck out with quiet resolve. One moment it was the outline of a woman holding a child. The next, streaks of light, drifting clouds, a bird in mid-flight. Occasionally, a doctor or nurse would glance her way. She'd look up and offer a gentle, unguarded smile, no hint of bitterness. In those eyes shone something far stronger than the winter cold, a persistent inner light. No one stopped to ask her story. Sometimes someone would leave a carton of milk or a leftover sandwich beside her. She'd offer a soft thank you and set it aside before returning to her drawing. For over 2 months, she'd been there every weekend morning. No one knew where she came from or why she was alone. Yet everyone came to recognize Zora Carter, the mysterious little beggar at Highland Crest, as an unspoken part of the winter tableau, patiently bearing witness to every life passing through those doors, herself a quiet miracle in motion. Facing the worn cardboard slab and Zora's tiny silhouette across the street sat a silver Range Rover, its paint shimmering in the cold morning haze. In this city, vehicles like that are symbols of success, status, a life untouched by the grit of the world. Yet that morning, amid the stifling leather scent and recycled air, Jonathan Reeves felt like a lost ghost. Jonathan had long been celebrated as a model of achievement in Birmingham's business circles, gracing magazine covers, shaking hands with Wall Street heavyweights, prideful of his fortune and influence. But today, all of that seemed like a distant luxury, utterly disconnected from the reality he now faced. His angular jaw and salt-and-pepper hair were impeccably groomed, yet his eyes were sunken, dark circles stark against skin drawn pale by sleepless nights. His charcoal Tom Ford suit remained pristine, his Italian leather belt gleamed, but the crease at the corner of his mouth, the slight tremor in his grip on the steering wheel, all betrayed a weariness that ran deep and stubborn. Jonathan didn't drive straight into the hospital. He stayed parked, his thumb tracing the contours of a worn wedding band, his gaze fixed through the windshield on a crowd of strangers passing that nameless little beggar girl. In his rearview mirror, he caught sight of his son, 6-year-old Ian Reeves, tousled brown hair, once round cheeks, now gaunt and prematurely aged. Ian sat strapped into his car seat behind him, legs tucked beneath a pink blanket his mother had knitted. There was no spark of curiosity or joy in Ian's eyes, only emptiness and stillness, as though the world had abandoned him. Since the accident, everything in the Reeves household had changed forever. A cruel collision on the drive home from school, a moment's impact with a truck, had left Ian's little legs permanently injured. The boy who once raced through yards, climbed trees, chased puppies now watched the world only through glass, silent like a spirit trapped behind walls. Jonathan had always considered himself an ideal father, hiring private music tutors, enrolling Ian in costly sports lessons, showering him with the finest toys. But after the tragedy, he compensated only with expensive gadgets and exclusive therapies at top hospitals, unaware that what Ian needed most wasn't money, but understanding and a real reason to hope. Yet the deepest wound belonged to Jonathan himself, the man who once believed every problem could be solved with money, now utterly helpless as he watched his son unable to walk, unable to smile, unable to call him Dad with that look of admiration he once knew so well. Each morning, Jonathan drove Ian to the hospital, forcing a strong facade for his son's sake, while inside his heart grew cold and hardened to everything around him. He began avoiding friends' gatherings, even his wife's caring gestures, and each night sat alone with a bottle of whiskey, punishing himself in silence. Deep down, Jonathan feared the greatest loss of all: hope, not just for Ian, but for himself. He grew to dread emotions, to fear believing in miracles, reluctant even to entertain the smallest possibility that might shatter him. Then, just as he reached to open the door and carry Ian inside, Jonathan's gaze drifted back across the street, to where that little black girl still sat, frail and small, her expression calm, offering a soft smile as someone hurried by. For some reason, that look sent a chill through him, as if a silent question echoed through the frosty air. What truly can heal our deepest wounds? Money, power, or something else he had long since forgotten? And in that instant, from the depths of Jonathan Reeves stirred a quiet darkness, the loneliness, the guilt, the unacknowledged longing for redemption. And just across the street, in the small posture of a child wrapped in a tattered coat and clutching a battered notebook, fate was quietly setting into motion something far beyond any of his calculations. At that moment, just as Jonathan Reeves leaned down to open the car door and carefully lifted Ian into his arms, the faint warmth of his son's small body seeping through his fingers, the world outside seemed to fall silent for a few precious seconds. The crowd still jostled at the hospital entrance, distant sirens wailed, yet amid the clamor a small voice rang out, clear and unnervingly confident. "Sir, I can help your son walk again." Jonathan froze, certain he'd misheard. For a heartbeat, his eyes met Zora's. The little beggar girl in an oversized gray coat, her duct-taped boots, and those unwavering dark brown eyes locked on him. In that instant, he saw every line of her face more clearly than ever, not hardship or pleading, as with so many street children, but a calm resolve laced with a strange certainty, as if she were stating the obvious. Heat rose in his cheeks. How many times had he encountered beggars staging heart-wrenching scenes outside hospitals to wring money from passers-by? In America, everyone was wary, everyone wounded by empty promises, Jonathan especially, who'd been betrayed in both business and life, but this time felt different. Zora's gaze didn't tremble or stray. There was no hint of servility. It was the eyes of someone who'd endured bitterness, yet still believed in something good. He hugged Ian tighter and turned away without answering. his voice rough. "Don't joke about things like that. This isn't a game." But Zora wouldn't back down. She stood her ground, clutching her sketchbook to her chest, her voice gentle but unwavering. "I'm not joking, sir. If you let me, I will show you." Her words pierced Jonathan's thick armor like a needle. Confusion, anger, and shame flickered through him all at once. Doubts and a flash of contempt surfaced, instincts of a man raised among the elite, accustomed to seeing through every con. The true adversary in Jonathan at that moment wasn't a person, but the harsh defenses of a man who'd lost his faith. He wanted to dismiss Zora as a crafty street urchin exploiting his pain for pity, ready to walk away and refuse her any chance to explain. But contrary to his expectations, Zora didn't react like any child he'd ever met. She didn't cry, didn't plead, nor did she lash out. She simply stood still, her eyes following father and son until Jonathan carried Ian inside the hospital lobby. It was then, deep within Jonathan, that a strange sensation stirred. Not irritation as before, but a flicker of curiosity, a nameless unease. The more he tried to brush it aside, the more it lingered, like a scratch quietly bleeding beneath skin long since hardened. As he stepped through the hospital's glass doors, he still heard Zora's words echoing in his mind, repeated like a challenge delivered with uncanny confidence. "I can help your son walk again." And despite his attempts at stoicism, beneath that cold exterior, for the first time in months, Jonathan felt the fragile bud of something he feared most: hope. Zora's clear yet unwavering voice wound around Jonathan's mind like a red thread, no matter how hard he tried to ignore it. As he carried Ian into the main lobby, the shuffle of nurses' sandals, the wails of crying children, the tang of disinfectant, and the glare of fluorescent lights overhead couldn't drown it out. It replayed endlessly in his head, forcing him to frown as if willing it to stop. But the harder he tried, the more the words sank in, especially as he confronted the hospital's cold professionalism. Printed diagnoses reading "full recovery uncertain," sympathetic handshakes from the head physical therapist lacking any real faith, and the empty encouragement of "let's keep hope alive," which sounded to Jonathan like the hollow tick of a clock. He sat beside Ian's bed and watched as a nurse tested his son's reflexes, tapping each foot in turn. Ian complied meekly, his face blank, eyes drifting away whenever someone looked at him. The same look Jonathan saw in the mirror late at night, unrecognizable in his own reflection. A lump formed in his throat. Despite every resource, top specialists, private therapy, medications, high-tech treatments, Ian's legs remained motionless. The family's faith had been ground down to dust. Jonathan sometimes wondered if he, too, was starting to believe that miracles were just fairy tales. Yet Zora's words kept slipping in, knocking on the locked corners of his heart. "I can help your son walk again." It wasn't idle comfort, it was a promise, a firm assurance, coming from a lonely, impoverished child outside the hospital. Jonathan should have brushed her off, yet he couldn't. The doctor repeated the familiar lines. "Rehabilitation is a long journey. It takes patience. We can't predict outcomes, but let's trust in science." Jonathan smiled politely and signed the paperwork while his mind raced. Am I foolish to cling to such a fragile hope? Or is my own fear keeping me from trying something different? That afternoon, after all the formalities, Jonathan quietly carried Ian back to the car. The drive home felt endless. In the hush of the cabin, Ian stared out the window, silent until finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Dad, the little girl by the gate said I could walk again. Do you believe her?" Jonathan froze. Part of him wanted to answer, "No, it's just a sweet lie. Don't set yourself up for more pain," because he feared his son's hope would shatter again. But another part, deeper and more fragile, whispered, "Maybe there are still wonders in this world I've forgotten." He turned to look at Ian. Those eyes weren't empty, but full of a blend of innocence and a yearning to believe in a small miracle. Jonathan felt his throat go dry and his heart beat harder than usual. In that moment, the layers of his cold, bitter defenses, the ones that shielded him from disappointment, began to melt. He didn't answer right away. That night, after he put Ian to bed, Jonathan sat long in the living room. Work documents lay spread across the table. His laptop screen glowed with stock tickers, but his mind kept circling back to one question. Do I dare give my son a sliver of hope, even one more time? Is faith really as dangerous as I thought? In the darkness, Jonathan asked himself, was he afraid of hope because he feared failure, or because one day he might miss a miracle just by refusing to believe? And that night, in the quiet house, Zora Carter's words kept echoing like a small electric current, keeping Jonathan awake, restless, unable to find peace until dawn. That night, Jonathan hardly slept. From the office window, he watched the frosted courtyard below, the pale yellow streetlights fading behind the cold mist. He kept recalling the look in Ian's eyes when he asked about the girl by the gate. A faint spark, yet enough to shake a hardened man like him. By the next morning, before the sun had fully burned off the dawn fog, Jonathan had made up his mind. He needed to face this obsession, not just for his son, but for himself. He left the hospital with Ian earlier than usual. The moment his car stopped by the curb, he saw Zora, sitting on her familiar scrap of cardboard, her oversized coat enveloping her frail frame, head bent over the paper, but her gaze quietly surveying everything around her, as though she'd never left. This time, Jonathan couldn't look away. He stepped out, lifted Ian into his arms, placed him beside the cardboard, then walked straight up to Zora. His voice was cool, but quivered with tension. "Why do you dare to say that? What do you know about my son? Who do you think you are, making promises like that?" Zora looked up. Morning light slanted across her face, casting a glint in her deep eyes. She wasn't afraid or arrogant. She set her pencil aside, hugged her sketchbook like a talisman, and spoke in a steady, gentle voice that carried unexpected weight. "I'm not a doctor, sir, but my mother used to help people walk again, even when everyone thought it was impossible. She was a physical therapist for accident victims. An old soldier who'd been paralyzed for 5 years walked again because of her. Mom taught me every exercise, every way to listen to the body. She said, sometimes all the body needs is a reminder that it's still alive, still remembers." Jonathan paused. Her story didn't sound like a child's tall tale or fabrication. In her eyes, he saw a grief only someone who's truly suffered could know. He softened his tone. "Where is your mother?" Zora was silent for a moment, then replied quietly, "She's gone. Before she died, she told me that if I could, I should help someone the way she did. I just want to try, with your son. I'm not asking for money or anything else. I only ask for 1 hour." Her words, plain and sincere, cut through Jonathan's thorny defenses. He didn't know whether to believe or doubt her. A shadow of suspicion still lingered. He was a businessman burned by others, betrayed in his weakest moments. That darkness urged him to imagine every scenario. Maybe she's part of some con? A child actor hired to play on people's sympathies? Yet no matter how hard he reasoned, he felt his resistance weaken in the face of Zora's simple honesty. He looked closely. No one was hiding behind her. No one watching from a distance. No telltale sign of deceit. There she sat, fragile yet steadfast, like a small stone anchored in a rushing stream. Silence fell between the three of them. Ian sat in the car, peering through the window, his eyes lit with a mixture of curiosity and hope. In that moment, Jonathan realized if he didn't take this chance now, it wouldn't just be Ian who lost out, but himself, too, shutting the final door on hope. Jonathan took a long breath, studied Zora for a few more seconds, then said in a low voice, "All right, 1 hour, and if anything goes wrong, I'll stop it immediately. But you must promise me one thing. You won't harm Ian, not even a little." Zora nodded, her eyes shining with unspoken gratitude. For the first time, a small but determined agreement was forged. Between a father who believed his faith was spent, a boy in a wheelchair longing for a miracle, and a little beggar girl carrying her mother's legacy. Together, the three of them headed toward the small park behind the hospital, the place where their fragile pact would be tested, and where Jonathan would soon find himself confronting the darkness in his soul more deeply than ever before. The three of them turned off the crowded street, passing under a row of bare maples that led into Harrington Park, where the old swings creaked in the breeze and the late afternoon light washed the grass in muted gold. Jonathan hesitated as he set Ian down on a nearby bench, his eyes never leaving Zora even though he was trying to appear calm. Every step felt like a battle between reason and the fragile hope stirring inside him. Zora set her little worn tote bag on the grass beside the bench and carefully pulled out each item. A frayed washcloth, a cloth-wrapped pouch of rice, a faded tennis ball, and a nearly empty jar of cream. They were humble tools, even impoverished in their simplicity. But in the way she handled each one, Jonathan sensed something entirely different. Reverence, as if each object carried a sacred memory of the mother she had lost. "I'm going to warm this rice bag to ease his muscles," Zora explained, her voice clear and gentle, her eyes on Ian, not like a doctor examining a patient, but like a friend waiting for permission. "If it gets too hot, just tell me, okay? Nobody should be in pain or discomfort." Ian hesitated for a moment. Then, when Zora gave him that quiet smile, nodded shyly. For the first time since the accident, someone was talking to Ian as if he were an ordinary boy, not a pitiful case study or a project to be fixed. Zora was neither rushed nor patronizing, nor did she skirt around Ian's still legs. She just worked patiently, step by step, without forcing anything. When the warmed rice bag was placed on Ian's thighs, he winced, but Zora immediately asked, "Is it too hot?" He shook his head. Then she gently massaged around his knees and rolled the tennis ball under his foot. She asked him about his favorite cartoons, about the pet he'd choose if one day he could run and play again. With these little questions, Zora drew Ian out of the treatment mindset and back into the innocent world of childhood, where dreams still lived. Jonathan stood off to the side at first, arms crossed, defensive. In his head he kept asking, "Is this all just child's play, or is there really something here?" But every gesture Zora made held his gaze. It wasn't the clumsy mimicry of a child imitating adults, but a quiet, gentle, unwavering faith. After a while, Zora stopped, crouched down to Ian's level, and tapped his ankle with her fingertip. "Ian, do you feel anything?" Ian was silent for a moment, then furrowed his brow and said, "Kind of warm, and I think my toes moved a little." Zora smiled. She glanced at Jonathan, and that smile made him stumble through a storm of emotions. Jonathan approached and checked Ian's legs himself, suspicion and wonder mingling in his eyes. It's probably just a coincidence, he told himself, but his hand trembled with excitement. It had been so long since a medical test yielded anything but disappointment. Yet today, using only a rice bag, a tennis ball, a few encouraging words, and the patience of a little stranger, Ian had, for the first time, truly felt his body alive again. Zora made no boast and remained unhurried. She kept talking, kept coaxing Ian to flex his toes and rotate his ankles, inch by inch. All afternoon, Jonathan realized how completely the atmosphere had shifted. Gone were the cold instruments and pitying glances of doctors. Only childhood chatter, giggles, and the small yet miraculous movements of legs that had lain dormant for so long. Before they parted, Zora spoke in that same strangely confident tone. Every body remembers. It just needs to be reminded. If Ian keeps trying, one day he'll walk on his own. Jonathan fell silent. As the dusk deepened, he saw more than despair in Ian's eyes for the first time. A fragile spark of belief rekindled by a simple miracle from the heart of a little beggar girl. And in that moment he didn't yet realize how much his own hardened defenses were beginning to crack. The late afternoon sun had softened as it spilled across the grass of Harrington Park, where the three of them had just shared moments that, though small, were filled with meaning. Ian still sat there, his little hand resting on his knee, eyes wide with excitement and wonder at the new sensations he'd just felt in his legs. Zora gathered her simple tools back into her worn canvas bag, wiped the last of the cream from her fingers, and prepared to stand and walk away, as if the entire afternoon had been nothing more than a fleeting scene with no lasting trace. But Jonathan remained rooted to the spot, his heart tangled in conflicting emotions. On one hand, his hard-won instincts and lifelong wariness told him never to trust in a vague miracle, especially one offered by an anonymous, uncredentialed, poverty-stricken little girl who'd been begging at the hospital gate. On the other hand, he couldn't deny that after months of treatments, this was the first time Ian hadn't merely received therapy, but had genuinely come alive, laughing, hoping, looking ahead. For a father whose faith had all but dried up, that alone was a miracle, however small. Flustered, Jonathan fumbled in his wallet, his hand trembling as he withdrew a crisp $20 bill. He extended it toward Zora, forcing himself to sound calm. "Thank you, Zora. It's not much, but please accept this, just a token of my gratitude for what you've done for Ian today." Zora looked up without flinching and shook her head, her voice steady and clear. "I don't need the money, sir, really. I'm just happy Ian smiled, that he felt his legs again. I did this because my mother taught me to. She always said that sometimes helping someone is worth more than any amount of money." Jonathan froze. For the first time in years, he felt like the one being taught a lesson. He was the businessman who'd used money to solve every problem, in big contracts, in hiring top doctors, even in buying hope for his son. And now here was a little girl with only a canvas bag and a handful of simple tools, refusing the cash he offered. And it left him bewildered, almost embarrassed. The real obstacle inside Jonathan in that moment wasn't doubt about Zora, but shame. A recognition that for years he'd forgotten the value of the simplest, most selfless acts. Zora's quiet dignity, strong yet unassuming, had pierced through his own tough exterior to reveal the vulnerability beneath. Ian watched it all, his eyes shining. He might not have understood every word exchanged, but he grasped one thing, that unconditional kindness still existed in the world. Zora dipped her head in thanks, then turned to Ian and offered her small hand. "Ian, if you ever need me again, I'll be here. Just don't give up, okay?" Her bright, confident smile sparked something strange in Jonathan. Perhaps he thought belief in the impossible sometimes begins with the smallest miracles and the people we least expect. That evening, long after Zora had disappeared behind the maple trees, Jonathan stood in the fading light, clutching the unused $20 bill. He realized that for the first time in years, his heart was no longer filled with fear and bitterness, but instead held a fragile glimmer of faith, unfamiliar, frightening, and wonderful. In just one moment, everything can change. And maybe the true miracle had already begun, sparked by the smile of a little beggar girl named Zora Carter. After that first afternoon, as if by a silent promise, the Reeves family returned to Harrington Park with Ian every week. Healing was no longer just the domain of physical therapists or hefty bills. It had become the new heartbeat of all three of them, quietly steady and full of anticipation. Each time, Zora arrived first, settling onto the familiar bench beneath the old maple, her little canvas bag at her side, eyes carefully watching everyone who passed. Seeing her arrange each worn tool, meticulously wipe down the tennis ball, and gently untangle the rubber bands, Jonathan felt as though she were a bona fide little doctor. No white coat required, only dedication and a pure heart. Zora was never late, and she never seemed tired, even when the rain drizzled or the wind cut like blades. Her patient gaze and warm smile were the true draw for the Reeves family, not just the therapy itself, but the emotional anchor she provided. Their exercises also grew more varied. Beyond massage and warming muscles with rice bags, they added homemade resistance bands, rolling the tennis ball under Ian's foot, and even using an empty water bottle to practice basic reflex drills. With every movement, Zora explained each step, urging Ian to be patient and to listen to his body. Her questions did more than check his sensations. They sparked his curiosity about how muscles work, the possibility of recovery, and the things he'd thought lost forever. At first, Jonathan stayed back, observing with the cautious eye of a grown man used to controlling every risk. But then Ian, when he first lifted his ankle, flexed his knee or wiggled his toes, shattered all of Jonathan's doubts. Some sessions, Zora even invited Jonathan to join in, so Ian would know he wasn't alone, and so his father could feel the arduous but hopeful effort firsthand. Jonathan stumbled at first, fiddling awkwardly with the bands and water bottle, even dropping the tennis ball, which made Zora laugh. That laughter, real laughter for the first time in months of tension, blurred the once strange distance between father and son. As they worked, they talked more about work, childhood memories, Ian's favorite cartoon. Bit by bit, the fragments of their broken family clicked back into place, as quietly and naturally as grass after rain. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. Some days, Ian felt nothing new, and his face fell in disappointment. Other days, Zora repeated the same motion a dozen times, patiently urging him not to give up. And sometimes Jonathan hesitated, afraid his son's hope would be dashed again. He even found himself asking Zora, in a stern adult voice, "If things don't improve, do you promise to stop, so Ian won't cling to false hope?" Zora fell silent, met Jonathan's gaze, and replied in a voice far wiser than her years. "I can't promise a miracle will come soon, but I promise Ian won't be left with despair. No one deserves to be abandoned in their hope." Answers like that left Jonathan unsettled, forcing him to ask himself, had he ever truly persevered for his son, or had he been afraid only for himself? Week by week, each small but precious movement in Ian's legs became their shared victory. The first time Ian lifted his heel, then bent his knee, Zora let out a soft cheer, Jonathan squeezed his son's shoulder, and Ian couldn't hide his bright smile. Those tiny triumphs, a gentle toe twitch, a warm tingle in the knee, were enough to spark hope for a long road ahead. And for Jonathan, each of those moments was not just a miracle for his son, but a healing balm for his own heart, a heart that had grown parched, skeptical, and afraid of the impossible. The steady progress and rare laughter in the park seemed to redraw a brighter horizon for the Reeves family, but every healing journey must pass through its darkest hour, where even the faintest hope is tested to its limit. For Ian, that moment came on a Sunday morning heavier than any before. Gray skies pressed down through his bedroom window as Jonathan stepped inside. Before he could even call out to wake him, he found Ian curled on the edge of the bed, legs tucked beneath the blanket. His eyes were puffy and red, eyelashes matted with tears. "Dad?" Ian's voice trembled, choked by sobs. I can't feel anything. My legs are like stones. I've tried and tried, but nothing. Didn't I move a little just last week?" Jonathan's heart clenched. He moved closer to comfort him, but as soon as he touched Ian's shoulder, the boy pushed away and burst into tears. "I'm tired of this. I don't want to try anymore. Every single day of practice and nothing changes. I hate this feeling. It's all pointless." Ian's cry shook Jonathan to his core. In his son's eyes he saw not only disappointment but anger, an ache of betrayal when the hope Ian had built for himself collapsed. Each angry word felt like an icy spike against the armor Jonathan had spent years forging. He wanted to wrap his arms around his son, but he was afraid. Afraid that if he comforted Ian, he'd have to admit that he, too, had wanted to give up so many times. Afraid that looking into Ian's eyes would force him to face the fear, helplessness, and pain he'd hidden behind work, money, and logic for so long. Jonathan sank onto the bed beside him and stayed silent. Old memories flooded back, carrying Ian through the backyard, his hearty laughter promising, "I'll always be here. You never have to be afraid." Now that promise seemed to unravel in a single, desperate morning. In that moment, his villainous side surged. He thought to himself, "I shouldn't have built this hope. I should have kept him safe in hard reality instead of risking more pain." Doubt and fear roared in his chest. He felt the urge to blame Zora, that she'd planted a false hope in Ian and him, that her exercises, her encouragement, her smiles were nothing but a cruel illusion. But another part of him whispered the truth. Even the tiniest spark of warmth, the brief tingle at Ian's toes, had made Ian laugh, dream, and believe again. If he abandoned his son now, they'd both be cast back to square one. And this time, maybe no one would have the strength left to rise again. That afternoon, Jonathan called Zora with a voice thickened by helplessness and regret. "Zora, Ian doesn't want to practice today. He's exhausted. I don't know what to do." On the other end, Zora's calm voice replied, "Mr. Reeves, I understand. Even the strongest people get tired. Let me come, not to practice, but just to sit with him, okay?" Jonathan fell silent, thankful. And so that evening, Zora arrived at the park not as a little therapist or a bearer of hope, but simply as a friend. She sat beside Ian on the bench and said nothing about exercises. Instead, she told him about her mother, about the bitter failures she'd endured, and how she, too, had once wanted to give up after her mother died. She admitted she'd cried, felt anger, even blamed the whole world, but if she hadn't kept trying, her courage would have died too. Ian was quiet for a long time before finally looking at Zora. "Were you ever scared?" he asked softly. Zora smiled, eyes shining with wisdom beyond her years. "Of course I was, but I think being scared doesn't mean you should stop. It means you're on the brink of something remarkable." As twilight settled, the park fell into a peaceful hush. Jonathan watched the two of them and felt both relief and heaviness in his chest. He realized their journey wasn't just about healing Ian's legs, but a relentless fight against despair, each of them learning to conquer the darkness within before hope could truly take root. And in that moment of greatest vulnerability, a miracle bloomed once again, from the simple power of friendship, and from the tears that at last were allowed to fall. After that morning's crisis and the flood of released tears, the Reeves household felt quieter than usual. But instead of pushing away the sorrow as he normally would, Jonathan decided, for the first time, to let it wash over him, sitting beside Ian without forcing a smile or turning away from his son's despair. That afternoon, as the dying sun gilded Harrington Park, Zora appeared. She carried no canvas bag of tools, offered no eager pep talk. She simply sat next to Ian on the bench, said nothing of his therapy. Quietly, she watched the clouds drift above the canopy, then began to share memories that, though seemingly scattered, connected to Ian's heart in a profound way. "You know," she began softly, "there were nights in the shelter when I couldn't sleep, too cold, too scared. My mom was already very weak, but she'd always hold my hand and whisper, 'We'll be okay, no matter how bad tomorrow gets. As long as we keep trying today, tomorrow will bring a new spark of hope.' There were times I wanted to give up, stop waiting for anything. But every time I thought about quitting, I'd remember my mom's eyes and tell myself that if I stopped, I'd never know if something good might come tomorrow." Ian listened in silence, his breath slowing, his gaze distant. Facing this small friend, he no longer felt like a helpless victim, alone in his fight against fate. Zora, tiny, yet having weathered harsher days, sat beside him with calm strength, sharing her own vulnerability as her gift. She looked up at Ian and said almost in his ear, "Ian, I think everyone has the right to feel tired, to cry, even to hate themselves for not being able to do something. But we mustn't steal our own hope, because if we stop, the part of us that wants to keep living stops too." Those unadorned, heartfelt words felt like a gentle awakening. For the first time, Ian saw Zora not as the little beggar at the hospital gate, but as a true friend. Someone who understood exhaustion, had the courage to admit her fears, and the resilience to hold on even when hope dwindled to a single thread. Jonathan watched from a short distance, quietly moved. He saw his son's eyes change, no longer disheartened as they had been that morning, but attentive, thoughtful, and most importantly, truly connected to this extraordinary companion. Jonathan felt his own heart soften. Real empathy, unlike empty promises or grand lessons, had rekindled hope simply by staying present when it mattered most. As they prepared to leave, Ian reached out and took Zora's hand. "Tomorrow," he asked quietly, "will we try again?" Zora's smile that evening was brighter than any before, her eyes sparkling in the fading light. And on the drive home, Jonathan realized that there are some things science, money, even a father's love alone cannot provide. Only genuine empathy and shared vulnerability between souls who have faced darkness together. Hope, he understood, often ignites in the very moments when we feel weakest. The next morning, the Reeves household felt strangely light, as if the gray clouds had finally lifted from everyone's hearts. Jonathan was making breakfast, but kept glancing at his son. For the first time in weeks, he saw Ian emerge from his room on his own, his eyes sparkling with a small new light so different from yesterday's gloom. Still a bit hesitant, Ian spoke words Jonathan hadn't dared hope for. "Dad, can we go back to the park and practice with Zora today?" Jonathan's throat tightened, and a long-forgotten smile spread across his face. That afternoon at Harrington Park, a gentle breeze rustled the old maples, and the sky glowed a soft, clear blue. Zora was already perched on her usual bench, only this time, when she spotted Ian and Jonathan approaching, she sprang up and ran over with a radiant grin. The air felt unusually pure. No shadow of doubt remained, just the three of them embarking on a new chapter with much lighter hearts. Zora laid out her familiar tools and then looked steadily at Ian. "Are you ready? Today we won't push too hard, just one small step at a time." Ian nodded, his small hand gripping the bench's edge. Jonathan crouched beside him, steadying his son with a reassuring hand on his back, his own excitement barely contained. For a few silent seconds, they shared a tense stillness, where all expectations, fears, and fragile hopes pulsed just beneath the skin. Zora began by warming and massaging Ian's calf, knee, and ankle muscles. After each movement, she checked in kindly. "How does that feel? Want to stop?" Ian shook his head, eyes locked on every gesture. Then, as the late afternoon sun turned gold, Zora placed her hand under Ian's foot and gently tapped, coaching him. "Imagine you're kicking a ball. Just think about that motion, gently." Ian closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His face tightened with effort, and Jonathan held his breath with him. In that instant, it was as if a tiny current sparked through Ian's leg. First, his toes moved, then his entire foot, slowly but unmistakably, slid forward. Time seemed to stand still. Zora was the first to whisper her thrill, her smile breaking wide. Ian's eyes flew open, disbelief and wonder mingling in his gaze. Overcome with emotion, Jonathan swept his son into his arms, tears finally spilling free after so many hard days. "You did it, Ian. You really did it." They held each other tightly, speechless. For Jonathan, this wasn't just Ian's first victory on the road to walking again. It was his own triumph over the darkness in his heart, an admission that hope can begin with a single, brave step when you dare to try again. Zora sat quietly nearby, dabbing her own tears with the sleeve of her shirt. In her young eyes shone not only joy for Ian, but a profound pride. She had planted that first seed of hope in her little friend, and in a father who once thought he'd lost faith in miracles forever. That day, under the peaceful canopy of Harrington Park, 3 souls, once lonely and broken by pain, found reason to believe and reconnect with life itself, all sparked by the smallest movement of a foot that would change their world forever. After that first breakthrough, the Reeves household changed completely. Sunday mornings were no longer days weighed down by anxious waiting, but moments to look forward to, when laughter and hope quietly sprang up from the simplest things. Yet amid all those positive changes, Jonathan found himself noticing Zora more and more, not just as Ian's little therapist, but as an indispensable part of the family. One chilly afternoon, after practice had long since ended, Jonathan happened to see Zora huddled in a corner of the park. She hadn't gone home. She sat quietly, pulling her old coat up around her neck and clutching her small canvas bag. He realized that in all the time she'd been coming, he'd never once seen anyone pick her up, or heard her mention where she lived. His heart tightened with guilt and compassion as he remembered Zora's stories of shelter nights, of her mother, of nameless loneliness. For the first time, Jonathan truly looked at the injustice this little girl endured every day. That evening, just as Zora was rising to leave for her usual hiding spot, Jonathan didn't hesitate. He walked over and sat down beside her on the bench. "Zora," he said gently, "if you don't really have a place you can call home, would you like to live with our family? You'd have your own room, a warm bed, and you'd never have to eat dinner alone again." Zora froze. surprise and hesitation shining in her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her about home in such a caring tone. In that moment, behind her tough street kid exterior, something seemed to burst open, the longing to be cared for, to belong somewhere, even if only for now. Jonathan offered an encouraging smile. "You won't be a burden, Zora. With everything you've done for Ian, the whole family needs you." Zora looked at him uncertainly, then toward Ian, who was waving at her from a distance. She nodded quietly, a single nod that would change her life forever. That night, for the first time in years, Zora stepped into a home filled with warm, golden light. She was given a small room with blankets scented by sunshine, a little table for drawing, and a window wide enough to watch the sky. From that day on, Zora became a special member of the Reeves family. She continued to support Ian in every therapy session, but the greatest magic wasn't in the exercises. It was in the new energy that spread throughout their home. Each morning, Zora and Ian woke each other with childish jokes while Jonathan cooked breakfast and listened to their dreams from the night before. Every dinner, Zora was invited to sit at the table as a true family member, heard and respected, sharing stories she'd only ever dreamed of someone listening to. Zora brought the Reeves home back to life. She encouraged Ian to draw pictures, told tales of the days she and her mother wandered the streets, shared little tricks for staying positive during hard times. And Jonathan changed too. No longer cold and closed off, he became lighter-hearted and more attentive. He realized that Zora's presence had taught him and Ian about gratitude, generosity, and the true power of family. Many nights, after everyone else was asleep, Zora would sit quietly by her window, tears of emotion welling up in her eyes. After so many days just scraping by in a world that felt foreign, she had finally found a real home. And in this home, she wasn't just cared for. She was allowed to be herself, to give love, and to watch hope unfold in each family member, starting with the smallest things. Thanks to Zora, the Reeves family healed not only in body, but in spirit. Day by day, laughter, shared stories, and moments of connection erased the shadows that lingered, turning their house into a place where every new miracle could begin, rekindling faith in kindness and in the profound meaning of the word family. Since Zora became part of the Reeves family, not only did the atmosphere inside their home change, but the whole vibe at Harrington Park shifted as well. Every bright laugh and every small breakthrough by Ian sent ripples far beyond their little family circle, touching the rooftops and weary hearts of neighbors who had been drowning in despair. At first, Ian's recovery was a private matter. Just the Reeveses and a handful of nurses at the hospital knew. But one day, a familiar nurse passing through the park stopped in her tracks to see Ian, once motionless in his wheelchair, now wiggling his toes and even standing while leaning on the bench, with Zora and his dad at his side. Word of this spread like fresh air through the hospital wards and to support groups of parents in similar situations. Within 2 weeks, 2 or 3 other families were quietly gathering at the far edge of the park during Ian's sessions. Hopeful, skeptical, desperate for a miracle of their own. But Zora never let anyone feel left out. She'd greet each newcomer, patiently teaching children with paralysis or cerebral palsy how to breathe into their muscles, how to stretch, how to talk to legs they thought were asleep. To the parents, she shared every trick her mother had taught her: heating rice bags, rolling with water bottles, keeping a positive mindset, and the art of perseverance in the face of initial failure. Zora never sounded like a pint-sized medical expert preaching professional jargon. She spoke like a true friend. She never promised, "You'll walk again," but instead gently encouraged them. Every body can change. We just need to give it time, and give ourselves the faith to believe. Morning practice sessions quickly became gatherings for a new community of hope. What began with a few kids in wheelchairs swelled to dozens, some carried onto the grass, some trembling as they flexed their toes under thick blankets. Parents, grandparents, even local young adults came to watch, to lend a hand, to share tips on recovery. The once dreary park came alive, voices calling each other's names, cheers whenever someone managed to move a single toe, hugs of comfort when someone stumbled, and tears of joy at a child lifting a heel off the ground for the first time. For Zora, each case was more than just a duty. It was a story she honored. She remembered every child's name and checked in on them each week. When one boy finally managed to wiggle his toes, Zora would sit with him a little longer, share her own tales of despair, and gently remind him of her favorite line. As long as you don't give up, miracles can still happen. Jonathan, who had once felt utterly powerless, now rolled up his sleeves to help other families. He swept grass, set out folding chairs, brought water and fruit for the kids. His transformation was the clearest proof of hope's power. The man who had once closed himself off, who doubted and sneered at every miracle, had become a sower of hope himself, passing it on to those who needed it as much as he once had. Sunday afternoons at Harrington were no longer edged in cold gray clouds, but became times of laughter, of inspiring stories, of renewed faith and life blossoming where darkness had once lingered. Before long, everyone was calling her the Little Doctor, not because she held any credentials, but because she gave them their most precious gift, the belief that no matter how small or poor you are, anyone can be the miracle they and others need. And right there in that park, once just a meaningless stop on the way home, a true community of hope was born, all sparked by a resilient little beggar girl and her healing heart. The spread of hope at Harrington Park grew stronger by the day, transforming a place once marked by despair into a living testament to faith and humanity. Yet all the small miracles Zora had lovingly nurtured over the past 9 weeks seemed to be leading to one single moment. A gusty Sunday when that community would witness its greatest wonder yet, from the boy who had been the most desperate of all, Ian Reeves. That morning, Harrington Park buzzed with an unusual excitement. Families who'd shared similar struggles formed a circle around the grassy clearing, each face alight with anticipation. They weren't there just to practice or cheer. They were there to witness a living proof of perseverance, the journey of a child who once knew only a wheelchair, now preparing to face the greatest challenge of his life on his own. Zora sat close beside Ian, her small hand gripping his tightly. Jonathan, still standing tall but with tears in his eyes, hovered at Ian's side, gazing toward the sun-drenched treetops. No one spoke, yet everyone understood that this was more than Ian's battle. It was the final showdown for every ounce of faith, every doubt, every pain and fear that had haunted them all these months. "You ready, Ian?" Zora asked softly, her eyes full of encouragement, never pressure. Ian nodded, breathing fast. Though his hand shook with nerves, his gaze blazed with a rare determination. "Today," he said, "I'm really going to try." Together, Jonathan and Zora helped Ian rise from his wheelchair. His body tensed, muscles that had long slept now protesting with aches, but Ian didn't complain. The wind caught his tousled brown hair, sweeping away the old worries. A deep breath, then another. As Jonathan gently released his grip, Zora let her hand rest lightly on Ian's shoulder. Time seemed to hold its breath. Ian quietly felt the ground beneath his feet, each toe clinging to life like a sprout breaking through soil. The park fell utterly silent. Every heartbeat, Every hope and fear converged in that pregnant moment. Then, as if by true magic, Ian stood straight on his own, his legs trembling but unwavering. He balanced there for an eternity of seconds. His eyes welled with wonder and joy and pride. In that instant, all traces of failure, of despair, of the darkest days, receded behind him. There stood a boy who had once almost given up. Now, grounded amid an audience that had once watched his silence, now moved to tears by his triumph. A soft sob rose from the circle of onlookers, quickly building into a wave of applause. Tears streamed down faces, not only of his family but of countless parents and children who had long since stopped believing in miracles. Zora stood quietly to the side, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes shining with pride, not just for Ian, but for the journey they had bravely taken together. In her gaze was no hint of the shame that once came with begging outside a hospital gate, no trace of the loneliness of an outsider, but the strength and compassion she had grown day by day. After a few steady breaths, Ian began to lift his foot. Step by wobbly step he moved forward, 1, 2, 3, until he sprinted into his father's arms amid cheers and tears and unfiltered joy. Jonathan pulled Ian close, his voice catching as he whispered, "You did it, son. You really did it." And in that moment, the man who had once felt defeated by pain and doubt wept too, tears of rebirth, of belief in real miracles that can come when someone dares to love and refuses to give up. That day, it wasn't only Ian who rose. It was every broken heart and every soul that had tasted hopelessness. Harrington Park witnessed a journey from darkness into light, a moment the whole community would carry forever. The moment a boy who thought he had no hope stood up on his own and lifted the hearts of everyone around him to stand as well. The day Ian stood up on the grass at Harrington Park marked a new chapter, not just for the Reeves family but for the entire community around them. That miraculous recovery, once thought to be an impossible dream, had become reality before everyone's eyes. Those who had once wept under the harsh lights of a hospital ward now looked at life through fresh eyes, eyes full of faith. From that moment on, the Reeves home stopped feeling like a place of hidden wounds and silent suffering. Every morning, Ian's laughter, Zora's playful teasing, and Jonathan's gentle words of gratitude formed the happy soundtrack to what had once seemed like a broken household. Jonathan, the father who had once been lost in shame and doubt, had truly come back to life. He became not only Ian's rock but also an inspiration to other parents, showing them that miracles aren't bought with money but born from perseverance, generosity, and the courage to believe in things no one else dared to. As for Zora, the little beggar girl, she remained humble at the center of that healing circle. She accepted no payment and no accolades. When people offered to help or sponsor her work, she would simply smile and shake her head. "I just want to help kids like Ian, like I once was. All I need in return are their smiles and the hope they share with me." From a child who had scraped by on a cardboard mat in front of the hospital, Zora had become a symbol of strength, compassion, and the power to create miracles out of the smallest things. Through her hands and her heart, countless children who had lost their faith were reignited with it, and families who once shut their doors to the world learned again to open their hearts. Harrington Park was no longer a place of sighs and sorrow. It was a gathering spot for joy, applause, tears of happiness, and fresh beginnings. Every weekend, Zora's circle grew a little wider. New children came, new parents arrived, and each brought a new story, all born from the tiniest spark of hope. When the sun dipped behind the old trees, Zora would sit quietly beside Ian and Jonathan, watching the children practice walking, standing and laughing. She spoke little, but in her deep, compassionate eyes shone a whole universe of love, where past and present met to kindle an unquenchable flame. And if anyone ever asked what made that miracle possible, the answer was always simple. No matter who you are or where you come from, you can create something extraordinary in this world. Never lose faith in the small things and in those who seem the most fragile. It was that faith in small acts, in the power of kindness and persistence, that transformed a once overlooked street child into the very heart of hope. And in that place, anyone, whether Ian, Zora, Jonathan, or anyone who has ever felt despair, can find their way back into the light, beginning with a quiet, humble miracle. This story, transcending time and boundaries, reminds us, miracles aren't reserved for the lucky. They belong to everyone brave enough to believe, to try, and to love in the smallest ways. If this story moves you, please hit like, share the video with friends, and subscribe so you don't miss any of our future journeys filled with hope and humanity. Thank you for watching, and always believe that a miracle can begin with just one loving heart.